The ICF Training and Technical Assistance Team is honored to welcome you to this California Housing and Community Development training session offered through the Emergency Solutions Grant, Coronavirus Relief Consulting and Staffing Services Contract. I am Chris Pitcher from ICF, and I'll be hosting today's session. Today's training session is a part of our racial equity training series and is entitled Cultural Humility, our third and final session. It is my privilege to introduce today's presenter, Dr. Rajni Shankar Brown. Rajni.
Hello. Thank you so much, Chris and ICF and Kristen behind the scenes there. I'm so grateful to be back and to be in this wonderful space with all of you. If you've joined us for workshop A or B, welcome back and thank you for coming back and being here. And if you're new and you didn't join us for the first or second, no worries, you'll be able to dive right in today. And I also encourage you to go back when you have a chance and access the recording or slides, because there's a lot of good resources. And I love that ICF always kind of shares that out, and feel free to share in your communities as well. So I am excited for today. Again, I am Rajni Shankar Brown, and this is Cultural Humility Part C. And you'll see, in fact, here I have an art piece. I love art, and art is all of the forms of art are one way we can really tap into culture, rich culture, even as we're kind of pushing ourselves to grow as individuals who embrace and actively practice cultural humility. And so in this piece, you see a piece by Cindy Bernier, and it's called Parts of Whole. And I love it. It's kind of an abstract piece. And so different people view different things into it. When I look into this piece, I see human figures and forms. I also see kind of in the center, the white as a dove, kind of carrying a message of justice and peace. These are kind of symbols that come to me, including the yellow rays of light and hope. As we've done this series, I really feel that it has been a space of hope, to be able to pause in the frenziness of life and to intentionally focus our attention collectively together on cultural humility, knowing especially how cultural humility really connects and advances equity and justice. And so today again is a part of the whole, as we're doing our third part in this series today. I'll share with you, I did put a little chat introduction. So if everybody would be so kind, take a moment and just engage in the chat if you would. We would love to hear from you. If you could just share your name, pronouns, community, and then also just for fun, what is something that you are reading right now, or what is a movie that you may recommend to us? One of your favorite movies or books, right? I think part of the beauty of these spaces and workshop is also allowing us to connect. And when we think about cultural humility, it is centered around our shared humanity, centering relationships, remembering the humanity in each other. And part of that is sharing out. So again, if you would take a moment, I see Kristen has dropped something in the chat, how lovely, and Beneath a Scarlet Sky is a beautiful book. So I also recommend that. So our facilitators, so I have to share today, you're going to just have me solo along with Kristen. Donald was going to be here with me, but he's had some travel delays come up where he was traveling with work, and some sudden issues popped up. And so he's good, he's doing well, and sends his best wishes to everyone. But he won't be here today. But those of you who came to workshop A and B, know that Donald's voice and examples. And so if you're new, please do go back and kind of watch our A and B when you do have time. Again, I'm Rajni. I'm the president of the National Coalition for the Homeless Board of Directors. I'm also a professor and the endowed chair of social justice education at Stetson University, and an associate at Racial Equity Partners, and a lover of lifelong learning, and again, grateful to be in community with all of you. So, I love it. I see Miriam has shared in the chat box too. It's so fun to watch the chats come in. So please continue to share. Our agenda for today, So we have a full agenda, but again, please know that there is space and time today really for everyone to share out. And so I know often, everyone is very busy, especially this time of year. And some of you may be multitasking, and that's totally fine. But if you feel comfortable, feel free to speak and turn your video and audio on if you have things to share. Always fun to see all of you. And so, again, make this space for yourself, authentic in your learning. But we will have some whole group discussion later in this workshop and session. And so we just ask everybody if you could really participate. It would be lovely, because that's part of the work we're here to do, right? As we embrace and work to push cultural humility forward. So again, this is our third in the series that we have been doing. Today, we're going to go over a little bit of engagement and grounding. We're going to talk about a cultural iceberg, kind of a visual analogy for us to play with, right? And some metaphors along with that. We're going to talk about culture and cultural attributes. And then we're going to continue to dig deeper. So as we've done this series, those of you who've been coming, we've really tried to scaffold, right? And kind of start and dig a little deeper each time we're going in, getting into the understanding of cultural humility, both as concept, but also practice, right? Moving into theory, into application. We're also going to really make some connections today in terms of levels, but also the connection with the goal of equity. So this is, again, one thing that really separates cultural humility from cultural equity, because again, there's this kind of overarching goal that tells us that cultural humility is dynamic, it is ongoing, it reflects a lot of work, which is why we didn't do just one time for this one. It's a series, because you have to wrestle, digest, right? Take time to go into some of that reflection. And then, the real big goal is also pushing equity. And we're going to talk about that today. And then continue to look at the importance of bridging the intrapersonal with the interpersonal, specifically, right? And very intentionally for transformative systems change. So again, that change beginning in us individually, but the change rippling out into our organizations and into our systems. We'll have time for reflective discussion today. And as we close out today, I'm very excited because we'll look at additional promising practices, right? Some additional tools to add to our own toolboxes for us to explore and to apply into our lives and into the work that we're doing. And then there'll be some room for questions and comments. As we go today, again, feel free to use our chat. If you have a question or a comment, feel free to drop it. We'll try to respond to it. If we don't have the answer today, we'll make sure we reach out to you, right? And so always happy to share resources and to support in any way. This is such critical work that everybody in this space is doing. And so even as we dive in today, I just want to start by saying thank you. Thank you for the work that you are doing. If you look across the landscape of the United States, but especially in certain states, California, where many of you are situated, and I'm on the East Coast in Florida, we start to see a lot of issues that are magnified, especially issues connected to poverty and to homelessness, and the systemic connections, right, to all of the isms, especially racism and sexism and heterosexism. And there's a lot of work to be done, and this is heavy work. And I'm just so grateful to know, right, in this community space that we're all committed to doing this work. So thank you for that. Abundant gratitude and namaste. So some engagement and grounding. We're going to engage with content. We ask everybody who's here today if you would be able to really to maximize learning, engage and participate if you can, be present, actively listen, speak your truth. Remember that we speak with positive intentions. right? We speak with positive intentions. And intentions don't always equal impact on others. And we apologize when we make a mistake. And this is actually part of cultural humility, right? One of the big parts of cultural humility also acknowledges that sometimes we are going to make mistakes because we're human. And what matters is we are accountable when we make a mistake and we learn, right? And we grow from that. We assume that participants have good intentions until proven otherwise. And we ask questions so we can all continue to learn from each other and so we can collectively grow, right? Collectively grow. And I can't wait to go back and look at the chat box because I see more people have shared books and movies. And so that's awesome. Thank you all. So again, just as we dive in today, really thinking about framework and grounding for this work, we have to again go back to what is culture. Now, in previous sessions, we went into kind of specifics around culture. This is more of a holistic overview here, right? So culture refers to values, beliefs, perceptions, relationships, attitudes, practices, rituals, routines, and rules that inform the day-to-day interactions of people. Culture can be different for each person. It can be passed down from one generation to the next. And culture is more than just ethnicity and or race. Culture is also learned, right? We know it is often through social constructivism that we start to form culture, and that our lenses are often shaped even early in life, even though they're dynamic, right? They can always evolve and change. But we have a lot of lenses from the time we come out of the womb, thinking about all of the media messages that we are taught and bombarded with, right? Especially this day and age where we live in a world where we know that even children, right, they are coming out and they are having access to technology right away with a lot of messaging. Our schools, thinking about curriculum, but then also what is taught at home, in our communities, in the interactions that we have. All of this shapes and forms our lenses, which also interact and interweave to shape and form our culture. So let's think about this and really start to look a little deeper into what we call the cultural iceberg. And so this is a good visual, right, for us to play with. And as with any visual, visuals are often not perfect kind of instruments to explain really large and complex concepts, but they can be very, very helpful tools for us as we engage in metacognition and as we engage collectively to deepen our understanding and foster conversation. So when we think about the cultural iceberg, it's really interesting because when you ask people, right, what do you think of when you hear the word culture? Many times people will say things like food, right, festivals, dances, arts and crafts, literature, language, music, right? One of the powerful form of culture that's also universally connecting in so many ways. Holidays, fashion, flags, even thinking about kind of flags that communities and countries and folks have designed over time and shared to kind of represent maybe their culture, reflect their culture in ways. So these are all things that we can call surface culture. They're very important to culture, right? In fact, when you think about something like the arts, they are vital and integral often to the design and reflection and sharing of culture. They're also visible, right? More visible. So it's often, these are things that we can see. What we know that makes culture more complex often is there are many, many components and pieces to a person's culture. Again, knowing that every person has diverse culture, but there are many components that sometimes we don't see, right? And this can be a little bit trickier because we're not often going to see them as visibly, or it takes more observation and more investment to really understand the deeper culture. So if you look at this iceberg on the bottom, right, some of the things we may not necessarily right away see or perhaps understand and be able to decode without really knowing a person and getting to know somebody's own stories and their own cultural interpretations and reflections are things like even thinking about eye contact, facial expressions, gestures, right, personal space. What is somebody's personal space culturally? How do they feel comfortable? And this is different for everyone, right? Conversational patterns, tone of voice, different notions. So it's not just communication styles and rules, but even thinking about things like notions, right? What about courtesy and manners and friendship, how we view leadership? This is really interesting because there's different notions, right? Very, very different notions sometimes. What we consider to be cleanliness or modesty, or even, paradigms and perceptions and societal narratives around beauty. Concepts. So culture also includes concepts, and these concepts, again, can vary quite greatly. And there can be similarities and differences for people. Things like self, right? The concept of time. This is a really fascinating one where many anthropologists and sociologists have really done studies over time to understand this big concept of time and how it can vary, right, between cultures and communities. Fairness, justice, what we think of in time in terms of past and future relationships. Thinking about, right, even identities, roles, how they're attached to identities, whether that's age, our sex, class, family structure. Thinking about attitudes, right? What are attitudes? And a lot of this, again, some of those are coming from media, coming from schooling systems, coming from home, societal narratives, even global narratives, right? That exist, that start to come into different individuals' cultures, and people start to internalize in ways. And then thinking about things like religion, even thinking about different ways people problem solve. Everybody has a different style for that, right? And some of that can be culturally influenced. So again, there's lots of different pieces here. And we know when you look to the right, I've listed, these are some of the key attributes of cultural humility. So when we think about cultural humility, cultural humility has the attribute of openness. One of the first and most important things is if we're committed to cultural humility, we're coming out and saying, you know what? We're going to be open, open to learning, open to listening to other stories in layers, open to different perceptions and perspectives, understanding that my own experience may be very different than somebody else's, my worldview may be very different than somebody else's, so that openness is really vital. Along with self-reflection, this is ongoing self-reflection, right? Ongoing. And a building of awareness, really starting to be cognizant and aware of both ourselves, but also the world around us. Understanding institutional accountability, and all of this happening from a lifelong learning framework. So those who attended sessions A and B know we talked about differences between cultural competence and cultural humility. And one of the major differences is in cultural competence, often the framework sees an end point, right? You are learning about other cultures and communities, and you get to this end point of competence. In cultural humility, we are taught that there is not an end point. This is a lifelong, ongoing process, right? No end point. It takes constant work. And thinking about institutional accountability, this is where we start to think about, again, things like power imbalances, right? Empathy and compassion. Those are key attributes for cultural humility. Now this is kind of a terminology that comes out of the medical field around the term as it originated, right? Kind of other oriented. I put it in quotations because it comes from the field. It's not language I feel is comfortable of. Speaking of cultural humility, right? We kind of have these different ways even language is represented. And the word other, it can feel really funny or be used in different ways. For me, I'll just share on a personal note, right? I remember vividly, having to fill out demographic sections of standardized tests when we were taking tests in school, right? And sometimes in those categories, not being able to really find myself. And eventually they would have the category other. So a teacher would say, oh, you're an other, right? Mark the other. And to be thought of as an other always felt kind of odd, right? There was a discomfort for me in that. So I hesitate sometimes with that word. And then acknowledging power imbalances, right? Balancing power imbalances as well, right? Trying to understand all of that. I have a quotation here by Freya Starr that says, the portions we see of human beings is very small. Their forms and faces, voices and words. But beyond these, like an immense dark continent, lies all that has made them. All that has made them. So again, this pause for us to remember that often as humans, we make assumptions or we may make judgments or think we understand somebody and their story. But really, we're just seeing something that's very small, going back to the iceberg, right? What may be visible. And really, we have to remember the layers and all that may be creating, right? Creating I like to think of it. I'll just say my Amma, Tamil is my first language, my family's language, and Amma means mom. And Amma, my mom, growing up, she had a nesting doll. It was a Russian nesting doll, Moksha doll. And I loved playing with it, where you open each of them, right, until you get to that tiny little core. And I often like to think of us as humans like that we have all of these kinds of different layers. And while, we each see each other's, right, we often don't know all of those different layers inside. Sometimes we don't even take our own individual time to unpack and to get into those layers, right? I wonder, does anybody out there have a nesting doll? If you do, maybe you can drop it in the chat if you know what I'm talking about. But they're really fun, right? You open them and open them until you get to a tiny, tiny core. Okay, so let me go back, sorry about that. So here we have cultural competency and cultural humility. And this comes from the US Department of Health and Human Services. There's so much good resources out there for us. And again, even as we look at these different resources, we can start to see that they're often broken up in maybe the language varies a bit as well, right? But this here is pretty standard in starting to understand cultural competency as opposed to cultural humility, right? And this is kind of a deeper way for us to also understand those differences. Cultural competency is a developmental process in which one achieves increasing levels of awareness, knowledge, and skills along a continuum, improving one's capacity to work and communicate effectively in cross-cultural situations. Some of the strategies that are often taught and used and employed when you are focused on cultural competency is learning about your own and others' cultural identities. Now, I'm going to pause there for a second because here's the difference between cultural competency and humility. When we talk about cultural competency, often you start by learning about others' cultures, right? So you're going out to start to learn about others' cultures. What even in an education world, we kind of had multicultural education, right, for a long time. Now, cultural humility says the starting point actually has to be us. We first have to start on an individual level to understand our own cultures, our own biases, right? Our own experiences that have shaped our lens, our worldviews. From there, we start to understand individuals and communities around us, the beauty of diverse cultures. Again, what Maya Angelou reminds us, right? In diversity, there is beauty and there is strength. So to understand all of those, but first, starting with ourselves. So there's a difference there. Again, cultural competency, you're also encouraged to combat bias and stereotypes, respect other beliefs, communication preferences, values, and adapting, right, services. Now, again, remember, a lot of this originated from the medical field. So a lot of times, if you do a lot of reading around this, you're going to see sometimes patients, right, or the term patients are used, or clients. But again, as we talked about last week, the beauty of cultural humility is it really spans all different fields, right? So cultural humility, while it was formed in the physical healthcare field to really improve interactions between medical professionals and patients, it's now been adapted in numerous fields, from systems change to community organizing, to social work and education, library sciences, counseling, really spans the disciplines. And we start to see, right, again, some of these differences when you get into cultural humility. Again, that self-reflection becomes key. Also, there's a acceptance and acknowledgement that we don't know everything, right? We don't know everything. You're starting from a humble place, always being open to learning. And you're acknowledging that other people know their truth best, right? So we're not going into a community or working with an individual saying we know more than you, right? We value lived experience when we're coming through a cultural humility framework. We learn and grow from people whose beliefs, values, worldviews, experiences, perspectives are different from our own. And so we remain open to that, right? Open to learning. Now, we know, again, that cultural humility, right, while it does not start from an examination of other cultures, it again pushes us to still understand ourselves, but also things like privilege and oppression and kind of the systems, right, that exist, and how we are part of those systems, both in perhaps positive ways advancing equity, but also ways where we may be perpetuating inequities intentionally or unintentionally, but we're challenged to work at unpacking that, right? Unpacking all of that. So here's a quote by Joe Gallagher: "To be culturally humble means that I am willing to learn. I am willing to learn." I remember during our last session, we had one of our community members here had shared kind of lifelong learning being a motto in the community where she works, right? And that's a beautiful perspective to really embrace and to take. Now, these are three of the main essential pieces of cultural humility. So again, just kind of organized it here with a triangle, but again, understanding that all of these pieces around this triangle also are intersected. Lifelong reflective learning, respectful partnerships that recognize power imbalances, right? This is really huge. Institutional accountability. So I have a short video clip here to share with you. And this video clip, you're going to see Medina Jackson here is kind of starting off, and we'll talk a bit about cultural humility, but I like it. There's some diverse voices in here for us to listen, reflect, and learn with and from.
For cultural humility, the goal is to lower your own sense of self-importance, to be open to receive other people and other people's way of life, to be present, to be listening, to be open, to see.
We are all equals and we each have skills to share. You're talking about developing a partnership. I have something to give and you have something to give. And what are we going to create from that? It's not coming in as if you have all the answers because you're at the university. And I have none of the answers because I am from a minority community. You have to be relaxed, you have to be humble, you have to come not to a lower level, but to a level that people can understand what you're saying, can understand that you want to be there. Body language. Body language is such a big thing. If you're not comfortable, then you need to go into a community with people that are comfortable so you can see how they act, what type of clothes they wear, how they speak to people. Whether you're a professor or whether you're a student or a staff person or whatever your station is, there may be this kind of sense, you know, within our egos that we need to approach communities that we're working with a sense of knowing everything, of being the teacher. And in cultural humility, it's okay to not know, and it's okay to ask a question. It doesn't mean that you're not intelligent. It just means that you may not know something. So I think it's just important to approach folks who may have different social identities in that way, with a sense of openness, with a sense of listening and really seeing, listening to understand instead of listening to talk and teach, and occupying the space of being a true learner. I think that's important. Please remember that we are all equals and we each have skills to share. So even though we may not have all of the book knowledge that a university student has, we still have a lot of knowledge and skills, and we're still moving forward. And we need assistance with moving forward. And there's probably a lot the university students could learn from us too.
So in that, again, kind of coming out of Pittsburgh with their Center for Community Engagement, you see the video was kind of framed from an educational stance, but it's really applicable, right? No matter where we are working. So if we are in an agency where we are helping to assist and support people experiencing homelessness, it's again, cultural humility says, we're gonna not make assumptions, but we're gonna work to understand the individual and the communities we're working in, the experiences from their truth, the experiences, right, as they have experienced it, and learn from that. Learn and apply that and be responsive, right, in ways as opposed to bringing in our own assumption. And this is where lived expertise and experience is really, really valuable. So when you think about cultural humility and you think about that learning, it really values and honors lived experience, the diversity that each of us carries, right, and gives space for that. And again, you heard in the video, right, again, it brought up that we're acknowledging we don't know everything, right? And so sometimes we have to ask questions, or we have to learn or dig deeper. And if we make a mistake, again, it goes back to accountability. These are all different essential kinds of tenets of cultural humility. Now here, again, you see the tripartite model of cultural humility. This comes out of Jane's work, and you'll see here in this Venn diagram, again, the focus of intrapersonal, interpersonal, but then again, look at what brings that together. So starting with intrapersonal, this is again, the inward, ongoing self-reflection. The self-awareness, not only about self, but also about the world we live in. So if you think about even the world as text, we're taking time to always read and study and understand the world, to unpack it, right? Understand relationships and dynamics as we interact. So the reflection becomes really, really key to that. And then critique. So a big part of cultural humility is saying that we are going to take time to receive and be open to feedback, to self-critique, to identify ways that, we need to grow, right? Individually, but also in our organizations, right? How do we grow? That critique becomes a big part of this work. And again, so this is all kind of thinking about the intra or inward. Now, if you look at the interpersonal, this is where cultural humility says, we're also going to really think carefully, right? As we're building relationships, partnerships, centering equity in that. We're going to, use our framework and understanding of lifelong learning and affirming diverse cultures within our work as advocates and activists. And we're also going to have the moral courage to ask critical questions and to challenge power imbalances when we see them. And part of it is even learning to identify them, right? And again, this is all complex. It's kind of like a web sometimes, and we're having to kind of really understand, sometimes in silos, but step back to really understand the intersections of all of it. You'll remember last session, those of you who attended and participated, we watched the Unequal Opportunity Race video based on the work of Kimberly Crenshaw. And again, those intersections, right, are really vital also for us to understand. But again, connecting all of this is first of all that openness, that we are open to learning, open to being in spaces even when they are uncomfortable, open to saying, you know what, I may not have all the answers sometimes, right? And I have a lot of learning and growth to do. So that openness is right there. And then the accountability, right? Holding ourselves accountable, but also our organizations and our institutions, to be accountable, to say that we are going to grow and push for change. So here we see something called the experience of difference. And this is just one way to look at our own kind of interaction with difference, right? Kind of this big word, right? Differences. And so you see here in this model by Bennett, this model is the experience of difference. It starts from ethnocentrism, where you have denial, right? So this is kind of a denial where at this end of the model, you're really kind of denying anybody else's diverse experiences, perspectives, their worldviews, and just operating that your own experiences and worldview, right? That is truth. That is, how the world should operate in the norm. So it really is kind of starting, there's this denial, right? And as you go into experiencing difference and move into what Bennett refers to as ethno-relativism, you're moving from centering on yourself into actually starting to center, right, in community with other individuals and communities and people. So you're actively, right, starting to accept, but not just accept. When you keep moving over there, you're starting to adapt yourself, make adaptations as needed, and then you're starting to really integrate. You're starting to really integrate and affirm diversity and center equity, right? So you can really start to see that difference. And on this scale, one thing we want to know is, just like everything with cultural humility being really dynamic, not static, we find that even as human beings, when we encounter difference, right, that can also be very dynamic, depending on context or situation, depending on our own past experiences or our own lenses. There may be times where we're in a state of denial, other times where we're over here doing really good at integrating, right, and not centering ourselves. But again, that awareness and that reflection becomes really key to really starting to understand this. So I love this quotation by Melanie Tervalon. And remember, Melanie Tervalon and Jan Marie Garcia were the ones who coined the term cultural humility in 1998. So again, they were both very focused on multiculturalism at the time in the 90s, but also really, really committed to advancing equity because they saw so many inequities within the healthcare profession. And so that's where, at a time where in the medical field, cultural competence was the big focus, and even in social systems, social care models and systems, Tervalon, right, and Murray Garcia came back and said, we've got to push that. We need to expand and challenge cultural competence. It's not to say there aren't things that are worth, tenets that are worth embracing, right, or valuable there, but it's not enough, right? And we need to push and expand our understanding. And so that's how cultural humility really got coined. And so again, now it kind of spans different fields. And one of the things we know is there's a lot of benefits, and cultural humility, in fact, positively impacts especially service outreach and practice. One of the reasons is it calls on us to center equity, which calls on us to unpack isms. So again, going into all of the isms, right? Racism, pervasive systems of privilege and oppression based on socially constructed categories of race. That often these categories result in really disparate and oppressive outcomes for particular communities and people, right? So it asks us to unpack that. So again, when we look at the realities, the really daunting realities in our own nation, in the United States with homelessness, we see overrepresentation, both persistently, but even growing in certain communities. Indigenous, thinking about our tribal nations, Black, Latina, Latino, Latinx, Native, Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, right? Again, experiencing homelessness 9 times to the rate of white individuals. And then even Asian, that often get left out, right, of our discussions altogether because of smaller populations in some areas. But again, really, really seeing a lot of growth in homelessness, especially in certain communities, Hmong, Vietnamese, right? We start to see homelessness really surging. And so again, this calls on us to ask these critical questions. Even thinking about cis-sexism, right? Systems that oppress, that value cisgender individuals and uphold kind of the gender binary, and how that marginalizes, makes invisible, harms some people's lives, right? Experiences. And again, seeing the overrepresentation and disproportionality with homelessness when we look at our LGBTQIP Two-Spirit plus, right, communities. Overrepresentation and just really unacceptably high hate crimes, right, with trans communities where people are unhoused. So these are intersections that are really vital. And cultural humility, part of this work is saying we're going to unpack those isms. This is messy work and complex work, but we're going to individually and collectively, right, come together to do this work. One of the reasons I'm so grateful for these spaces, right, that ICF, that we've been able to come together to offer, because we're able to pause and to start to do this work. And it's hard work, right? So cultural humility is different from other forms of cultural responsiveness. Culturally based frameworks, there's many that exist, but again, cultural humility, right? It asks for us not only to develop that deep awareness on different levels, but to center equity. So here I have a quotation by Melanie Tervalon. The ultimate goal of cultural humility is a sense of equity, equality, respect that drives us forward. And so I love the word equity is there. And the understanding, in order to have equality, we have to have equity. So this is an image by Tony Ruth. And I think it's a great visual image for us to really understand some of these terminologies, right? These terms that can be quite complex in some ways, and different folks sometimes have different understandings around the terms themselves, right? And so this is perhaps one way to really understand this. Inequality is unequal access to opportunities. So in this image, right, you see the tree, one of the individuals has access to the apples and plethora kind of falling there, and the other individual does not have access. Inequality, it says we're going to distribute tools and assistance evenly. So here we're giving both individuals the ladder, right? Focusing on equality. But what we actually see again is the individual who had access to apples. In some ways, it's great. They have easier access, so wonderful there. But look at the individual there on the right. They still do not have access, even with the ladder. Because of the systems, the way they are built unequally and the structure there. And equity says, we're going to custom tools that identify and that address inequality. So here's where equity comes in and says, we're going to start to understand the bigger systemic issues. In this case, the tree is bent. In this case, right, we have a lot of apples growing over here, but not as much here, right? So even thinking about all of that, thinking about the ladder, right? What does an individual need in order to have equal access and opportunities and fundamental human rights, access to food in this case? And so the ladders become different. And then justice, right, asks us to fix the system, to offer equal access to both tools and opportunities. So here we start to see not only the equal or ladders being given, right? And in this case, they become equal because we're fixing the system oppressive factors and issues itself. So look at the tree trunk. It is now being fixed. So the tree is centered. We're starting to fix the growth of the apples, right? And so again, fixing those systems at their roots so we can all thrive, right? Everyone can thrive. And so again, a good visual for us to play with. So this is a kind of a short video clip I picked from Inclusive Communities, and it talks about equity and equality. And again, as we're thinking about cultural humility, this is another major layer, right, and major goal that we have to keep sight on. Really, a big part of cultural humility is saying we're starting at a place of lifelong learning and awareness, but we're also moving and using our agency to challenge power imbalances and to actively advance equity in our communities and in our world.
Before we can talk about equity versus equality, I want to first define diversity. At Inclusive Communities, we like to say diversity in its simplest definition means differences. We all have differences, from our glasses to our weight to how much money we have. That is diversity, and no matter how much people say it's hard to find diversity, that's not true. Diversity exists. It's about taking the time to acknowledge its existence and work to ensure action is taken to embrace these differences, not alienate them. Equality is often equated to fairness and sameness, and is based in the misconception that we all have the same needs and the same solution will work for everyone. Equity is based in access and opportunity, with the understanding that we each start with different advantages and disadvantages, and thus have different needs to attain access and opportunity. To understand equity, we have to compare it to equality. Now, I love this equity versus equality graphic, as it's the best explanation of the difference between the two. On the equality side, you see that we've got three individuals, our tall guy, our short girl, and our friend in the wheelchair. And you see that they're all trying to watch this baseball game, but there's this fence. With equality, they've each been given a box to use to be able to see the game. But obviously that's not working because our tall friend is now super tall and sees very clearly over the fence, while our short girl can just barely see, and she's still kind of on her tiptoes and struggling to see the game, while the person in the wheelchair can't see it all and they can't even get on the box. On the equity side of this picture, you can see that now we've given each individual exactly what they need to be able to see the game. The person in the wheelchair has a ramp so they can clearly get to the top and see the full game. The shorter girl has 2 boxes, which is what she needed to comfortably be able to see. And the tall person has no boxes at all because they didn't need the extra assistance in the first place. Equity is a process, which means it is continuous. We can't gain equity by changing just one thing. For example, the equity side of this photo shows our friend in the wheelchair has gained equity at this fence, but the work is not done. True progressive equity is about how can we ensure that he has equitable opportunities at all of the hypothetical and real fences in his life. Equity requires power, resources, and social responsibility to work hand in hand to change the structures and provide opportunities to those who were institutionally left out, marginalized, or oppressed. Equity is hard, but it's essential for us to make change in the lives of those who have been historically depicted as less than. From individuals with disabilities like physical, developmental, and mental, to people living in poverty without access to food or education or healthcare. It's important for us to understand that there is a long history of discrimination, which has created the present day inequities, which don't allow these individuals the same access to opportunity than those who don't have those differences. One of the greatest gifts that we give to students that we work with is the opportunity to share their story and to find value in their voice. And this increases awareness and a sense of empowerment. Everyone has their own stuff. Everyone is going through something that challenges their emotional and physical capacity to be great, but there is power in connection. So now here's your challenge. Be brave and seek out those opportunities to have authentic conversations with those that are different from you. Find out what makes them unique and what brings them joy. Then you do the same. Share your story because you have value as well. Now you've built community. And with community, we have power. We is always stronger than me. That we give to students.
All right. So again, while none of the visuals that kind of exist may be perfect, I think they give us things to start to contemplate, to start to introspectively think about, and to start to discuss out. Right. So part of this, my hope is that, all of this, we take back, we share and have engaged discussions in our own communities. Part of cultural humility says we're going to honor conversations and we're going to all push and pull each other, right, to continue to grow. And again, thinking about the power of community. And cultural humility really starts to bring this concept, which I like in Sanskrit. We have a concept called Sangha. And Sangha, it really translates to mean beloved community. And the idea is beloved community starts with you and me, right? Understanding ourselves and each other and honoring those truths and building out. And so, again, there can be a lot of power when we start to do this as well in really good ways that benefit everybody, right? Everybody. So this comes out of some of my research and work. And I said, for institutional and systems level changes to occur, working to understand and embrace the interconnections between intrapersonal, again, the inward, and interpersonal, the outward dimensions of cultural humility are imperative. And it necessitates ongoing individual and collective work. So if we're going to make these kinds of big connective pieces between inward and outward, intra and inter, right? We have to be willing to individually do work, kind of ongoing work, but also be willing to do collective work. And that is where, we're asking of our organizations collectively to ask some of these critical questions, to continue our own lifelong learning, right? By showing up, coming to spaces like this to reflect and think and grow. Continuing to read. I loved earlier in the chat seeing different books come in, right? From Night to The Sound of Music, right? So many different books people were putting in. I love that. That's another way for us, even through literature, to continue to grow our own understanding and reflective processes. So here I have a kind of an image for us to play with, right? Really starting to go back to understand again that interplay between inter and intra. So again, if we start to think about in the lighter blue circles there, kind of in this certain triangle, right? But nonetheless, this really, think about it as a moving triangle, right? It's kind of floating and moving, has a lot of motion to it. We see developing multi-level awareness. So, I think this is really important. A lot of times in cultural humility work, you're going to see a lot of talk about awareness from a self-awareness framework. I push us, right, to think about it not only from self-awareness, start from that place, but then to start to develop multi-level awareness. So start to think about and even become more aware of systems and structures and practices and cultures that exist right around you in your own community, your own workplace, right? So develop that really intentionally. Engage in ongoing self-reflection. And this has to be very intentional. Reflection, it's interesting. Because often what they found is if we're not intentional about really reflecting deeply, we often aren't really doing reflection, right? We may just have a brief moment where we're summarizing what kind of happened in our day or an interaction we had, but the reflection, the way reflection works, critical reflection especially, is it asks us to go further. It asks us to ask questions like, in light of this experience or interaction or learning, what does this mean for me, right, with my next interaction? Or when I return to this space in the future or tomorrow? What does this mean for me in terms of my own biases? Can I tap into something that maybe showed up? Those critical kinds of questions and making those connections. And then asking critical questions to engage in constructive critique. So the critique isn't just being hard on yourself, right? Where if you make a mistake or something doesn't go well, you just beat yourself up and you say, okay, that was bad, right? That was not good. We need to move into a constructive space. Part of that is giving grace to ourselves and others. Another big part of that is also, again, making those connected points, right? So when I critique, when I see gaps, what am I going to do to actually move those gaps forward, right? And sometimes one way we can do that is actually to create, even goals, right? So think about short-term goals, mid-term goals, long-term goals, right? If your goal is to gain cultural knowledge in your own community, how are you going to do that? What do you want to do? What are you going to do to accomplish that in the short term, in the kind of mid-term, long-term? Right? If your goal is to move from cultural self-awareness into holding institutions more accountable, what goals can you start to set for yourself and can you set collectively, even as an organization? So the goal setting can be very helpful here. Now you start to see the interplay. So again, we have the lighter blue, but if you go here to the darker blue triangle, right, circle, but you can see the circles kind of in that motion triangle. This is where we start to cultivate multi-level relationships. What are we doing to build healthy, authentic relationships in our communities? If we are working in a system where part of our work, right, is providing resources and working to close gaps and disparities, and we have tribal nations in our community, are we working to build relationships, authentic relationships? Are we working to make sure equity is centered, right? So we're not just coming in and laying solutions, what we think is the way, but we're listening and learning and working together, right? Working together to move things forward. Are we integrating, empowering people with lived experience, right? Those are part of the relationship building as well. Are we engaging in advocacy and activism? Are we using our sphere of influence? And this can look different for different people. It can be done in many ways, right? So sometimes people see advocacy and activism and they only think about somebody doing a protest, which is great, right? If you want to go out and protest, yes, right? We need people to visibly protest, and protest has always been part of shifting social movements. But there are many ways, right, to advocate, even starting right in your own home, having discussions, going back and sharing with family members, in your own workplace, right, to ask critical questions and to advocate in ways. To make sure that we are, educating. Maybe it's, signing on to a petition, right, in our community and being civically engaged. There are so many ways, right, to activate that sphere of influence. And then educating and challenging power imbalances, right? So educate on and challenge. So the education, again, this is where you move back into ongoing reflection, right? See that pink connection there, because to educate, it's lifelong learning. We're constantly educating ourselves. Even things continue to expand and grow. So think about language. Think about how even constructs around gender, how much has changed if you look at the past decade, right? Where now we're starting to, that we need to move beyond a gender binary, that a binary has harms, right, for certain communities and individuals. And so one of the ways we can do that is to change our language. We can share pronouns. We can honor each other's pronouns, right, and realities, right? These are all things that, again, we're trying to challenge those power imbalances, but it takes that self-reflection to be able to do. And then asking critical questions, engaging in constructive critique. That, again, comes back to challenging power imbalances. The critiques have to be constructive, hopefully, right? And there are times that we need to call out, but there are a lot of times we need to learn how to call in. Cultural humility, there's a real component of love, grace, and calling in as well to educate ourselves and others. And I think that's really beautiful, right? It can be very powerful. And if you look at the civil rights movement, it's really interesting. If you go back into a lot of the work from Ida B. Wells to Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. to Coretta Scott King and many, look at a lot of the revolutionary calls to push and to challenge power imbalances, racial inequities, economic disparities, but to do it also rooted from an ethic of love, right? An ethic of that shared humanity. And then thinking about, this is a dynamic, lifelong process, right? Dynamic, always shifting. Even when you think about culture is always shifting. As people, we evolve and change with cultures. Our communities, our interactions can be very different, right? Depending on one community we work in and another space that we work in, or individual to individual. And that's where listening in layers and honoring stories becomes really important. And then I have a sun here at the bottom, and you see the word transformative, right? Because the idea here is, if we are bridging very mindfully the intra and inter, we can start to really push for social change and transformation. Again, starting with ourselves, right? But then those ripples out into our community. So lots of things here to kind of think about and chew on, right, for us. So thinking about growing individually and organizationally. So if you look at kind of individual, now I just want to point out, right, for kind of digestion of kind of the concepts and content, we're often just kind of separating out. But remember, there's really this interwoven dynamic between this, right? They're very interconnected, and it's not really silos. When we're doing things individually, it impacts the organizationally, and the organization, often influences the individual. But we're thinking about awareness of our own culture, awareness and acceptance and difference, willingness to be uncomfortable, understanding requirements, accessing appropriate resources. And then organizationally, thinking about cultural self-assessment, right? Are we valuing? It's not just tolerating diversity. There's a lot of spaces, that I operate in where it's kind of like, oh, we tolerate, we tolerate and respect these differences. That's very different than valuing and affirming diversity, right? Institutionalization of cultural knowledge, and then adapting, right? Thinking about our policies, our procedures, our structures, our values, our services, and constantly going into reflection to say, are we, right? Making sure that we are centering equity. Are we making sure that we are operating from a place of cultural learning and learning from others, right? Truths, and allowing those truths to shine into this work. And so again, on the right, you see lifelong and dynamic process and some of the core elements, again, that Tervlon and Murray Garcia really paint out for us with the term cultural humility, right? All of those being very core. So I have kind of a reflection and share here for us, right? Thinking about kind of group discussion. If you were to look at this continuum of cultural competency, right? So kind of thinking about cultural destructiveness, all the way to cultural proficiency, but I'm gonna add to this, right? If we go past the purple, I'm going to add a rainbow over there, and under the rainbow, it says cultural humility, right? So being a goal where we know that it's not just proficiency, because honestly, it's lifelong, right? Lifelong learning. But even looking at this kind of continuum, think for a moment, right? Where are you on this continuum in general? Now, again, this can change depending on context or situation or even day or work environment. But again, where would you say in general are you kind of operating in the community that you work in now or communities you work with now? Right? Where are you operating individually? And then where is your organization on this continuum? Right? Are you, if you had to be really honest, right? Are you still at cultural incapacity? Can you see stereotypes or unfair hiring practices that may be visible when you start to unpack? Or are you moving into cultural proficiency? Or maybe you start to see elements where you're really moving into cultural humility as an organization. Where are you, right, on this continuum? I'm going to invite you all to, if you would be so kind to just maybe turn your mic on and video and just share if anybody's willing to kind of share during this, because this is really this is where it gets important for us. It's not just about hearing these concepts, right, but actually taking the time to reflect, and sharing aloud is one of the most powerful parts of this reflective process with cultural humility. So anybody can share. If you want to turn your mic on, you can turn your video if you want, but you don't have to. That would be awesome. Mark, I see your mic came up. Would you like to share? Eleanor? I see a few mics came up, but I want to give you all an opportunity. I'd love to hear from somebody. Is somebody willing to kind of reflect aloud in terms of where they see maybe their organization on this continuum? You may be reflecting, and that's fine. Okay, so I'm going to pick on Chris for a minute. Chris, are you willing to kind of share something, maybe a connection that you have with this?
Yeah, I think, the work that we've done, and I can't speak for my organization. My organization is 8,000 people. I can speak for my team, my team of 25. We have done a lot of work in understanding our inequities in racial equity spaces, our inequities in our hiring practices, our inequities in understanding different cultures that we interact with. Our work with tribal nations has also highlighted a lot of this stuff. We've taken a lot of time and effort to try to become culturally proficient. But I think our real goal is what you said, is the rainbow part at the end, where we have the ability to understand this is an ongoing process. We keep learning, we keep growing, but it is hard. I'll just use one example. And I know you know this example because we did an entire session on it. But there is, within the African American and Black culture, the use of a brown bag as being an entrance or not entrance into social clubs. You're too dark. You're light enough, you can come in. And we were, for the longest time, doing what we now call spotlights or lunch and learn sessions that we called brown bag sessions, because it was kitsch, right? Oh, we all remember taking a brown bag to school, to our lunch, and I think we overlooked the fact that is actually, culturally insensitive. And we made that decision that as soon as we knew that we changed that term. There's no need for that term to be used. So it actually did turn to action. So I feel like we're pretty far along on the continuum, but there's always something you're going to learn or discover that you need to just, learn, just take that learning and grow. So maybe that is all the way to humility. I don't know. It doesn't feel right to me. It feels like we still have a little bit of work to do, but it is a lot of conversations, deliberately thinking. And I think one of the biggest things that we've really seen with this work is, we have to do the learning. We can't expect, if I want to learn about the Tamil culture, I'm not going to expect Raji to tell me all of that. I need to do my own piece of this. And that's something that I think was hard to come to, because of course, being part of the dominant culture, kind of what to expect. So why wouldn't you want to tell me what to expect? But it's more about that learning, not putting your learned bad behaviors on other folks to correct. You need to do that yourself.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that, Chris. And I think that is actually such a powerful example to have been kind of part of seeing how that unfolded. So some of the things I loved, and I would actually say that was really what I saw. Cultural humility was really displayed actively there, right? Because there was this kind of acknowledgement or learning like, oh, there wasn't, it was not done intentionally, right? People just did not know the harms and the history behind the terms, right? And once that was learned, instead of just saying we're going to ignore that, or there was this accountability, like, oh wow, let me lean in, right, and let me learn more, and let me come back and say, I want to, publicly acknowledge, right, that this, was not the right thing to do, and we didn't know, but now we know better, and let's start to learn and grow from that, right? And then creating an entire session to really unpack and talk about that, and bringing in diverse voices and experiences to learn and to listen. That is powerful, right? Really beautiful. And a lot of times that doesn't really happen, right? To that full kind of fullness of that. And when it does, I think that it can be such powerful kind of learning and growth for individuals, but also collective growth. And so great example. Thank you for that. Does anybody else have anything they'd like to share in terms of a reflection? Miriam? Hi, Miriam.
Sure. Hi, can y'all hear me okay?
Yes.
Fantastic. My organization has, over the past few years, been stumbling from yellow toward green. And so we have recognized that this is work we need to do collectively. We've talked about it a couple times at a couple different layers of the organization. The place where I think we keep getting stuck, at least that's frustrating to me, is with the dynamic interconnections, particularly in the diagram you were showing us last about how the personal and the institutional need to be interwoven and constantly informing each other. And instead, we've landed in a sort of division where cultural humility is something that we are aware exists and we sure would like it, and we have special separate meetings where sometimes we talk about it, but we cancel them if anything else comes up because it's not central to what, because anything about what gets treated as the core business about paying people's rent or making sure that there's food for people to eat gets prioritized over that. And so we have it as this sort of separate strain that hasn't been braided, or separate string that hasn't been braided into the organization as a whole, and haven't figured out how to prioritize it appropriately and let it inform the rest of the work we do, as opposed to studying it separately as a distinct and somewhat lower priority.
Beautifully articulated. Thank you so much, Miriam. And I love, right, the wording that you used. It hasn't been braided, right? And it's not always informing. And that's really just powerful reflection, first of all, right? So part of the work of cultural humility is taking time to step back and to recognize and ask some of those bigger questions. And then the other piece of that is to start to say, well, how can we start to change that, right, in different ways? And it can take time, right, especially if you're thinking about that systematically and organizationally. The questions are a big starting point for that, though, right? And so how I'm uplifted, Miriam, just to hear you kind of articulate that out loud, right? To say, here is where we are, right? And I'm not seeing this connection yet that we still need to move towards, right? And, one thing that's really interesting about organizations and spaces too, is there's so many elements that are always changing and shifting as well. So sometimes it can be the external issues that we're working to address, right? So sociologically, like all of a sudden, maybe other issues have popped up in our community and they're pressing, right? So we have to put our attention there. Or maybe we've had shift in staff where there's a lot of turnover in organizations. So sometimes you feel like you're doing this work and then all of a sudden you have to start over, right? Because you have new people. And so it can be very complex in that way. I think part of it is we have to stay persistent and intentional in saying we're going to work at centering, right? And how is it that we're going to center and prioritize it? And just that commitment can be really challenging sometimes, but to start to really put that there firmly, it can start in itself to be then woven in much more intentionally into everything we're doing, right? And I love what Miriam just shared. That was really powerful. Thank you for that. Very, very much. Thank you. And I love your purple, by the way. It's one of my favorite colors. So I love it. All right. So continue to think, right? This is a really good thing to you'll get these slides from ICF. Take it back, right? One thing I ask you to, this is me, right? My kind of educator cap, but I think it's really healthy to sometimes put a visual like this into a space and to let everybody kind of share their own thoughts. Because sometimes it's even surprising where sometimes some people might feel like, oh, we're in the blue and purple, or we are rainbow. And somebody else comes in and says, oh my gosh, no, right? We're over here in the red. An example will be, I work at a predominantly white institution. And, there are various spaces where, the narrative or story is like, oh yeah, we're purple, right? We're moving into rainbow. And then, people who are not part of maybe the dominant cultures that are operating here, we're like, right? Every day is red right now, it's orange, right? It's, maybe a peak of orange, right? There's a lot more. And so perspectives even vary. And so part of this work is saying, we're going to make space really intentionally to have some of that critical dialogue and to listen to each other, right? And to allow for those layers to be unpacked. That's a big part of this as well. Thank you, Chris and Miriam, for sharing. So 6 conditions of systems change, right? There's lots of different ways when we think about systems change, and cultural humility needs to be kind of embedded right into this as well, into the framework, into as we do this work. Again, thinking about structural, but also transformative change. This comes out of the work of Wright, and I think it's a good way for us to start to understand. But again, remember that all of these things are also very much interlinked. So here's kind of another reflection. We don't have a ton of time today, right, left, but I wanted to put some of this out there kind of as bridge work for folks who want to continue to dive deeper and extend these conversations. A big part of cultural humility, again, is pushing ourselves to reflect, ongoing reflection, right? And so here's some good kinds of pieces to reflect on, to talk about within community. Reflecting and thinking of a time when you were not as effective as you wanted to be for someone needing your support, or you were received in a way not intended. Right? Where an interaction played out, it was not what you intended, right? To go back and unpack that, or it was not effective, right? And to unpack that from a cultural kinds of lens, or back to the kaleidoscope. I brought up a kaleidoscope last time. Think about the different elements that were in play in that particular situation. Now, again, I have an asterisk there on the first one, because this is one of those pieces that's core to our reflective processes. Right? What has shaped your own lens and lenses, even in this particular situation, but also worldview wise? What social identities are most visible and least visible within this situation? Think about what norms or values may have kept you from connecting on a deeper level or more effectively with this individual or individuals or community. What kept you, or may have kept you, from learning something new or better understanding the individual context and or dynamics? What dominant culture values possibly came up? Right? Again, this is a really big one to think about. What dominant culture values possibly came up? What biases may have been in motion? Again, we all have bias. Right, every one of us. And implicit bias can be a lot trickier, right? Because it's not always visible in ways, but we have to spend time trying to identify, and that's the way we start to mitigate and address and hopefully prevent acting out, right, on biases and breaking down those biases. I think I shared in an earlier session, again, not a perfect tool, but can be a very helpful tool in thinking about bias, the implicit association test. Again, you can do that for free. There's a series of tests, but a really good piece to further reflection. What could you have, or have you learned from the interaction or experience? And did this experience lead to any changes in behavior or teach any lessons? So you can take these questions, right, and they're adaptable, and you can ask them from an individual kind of framework and go through the exercise. Again, this takes time, right? Here's the one thing I love what Miriam kind of shared was, cultural humility, it sometimes gets pushed, right? And we see that a lot, where even in spaces where we understand the benefits and the value, how it's important, it often gets pushed. And a lot of it too is it takes time. Reflection, deep reflection, critical reflection takes time to go through, right? You have to be able to carve out time in the busyness of everything going on to sit down, to pause, to give yourself space to make connections. And we're finding that is even increasingly hard in the world and society we live in, because we live in a society that's kind of go, 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 right? Narratives around busyness. And we are also in workspaces where we're addressing really pressing, urgent issues. So that adds a whole another layer there, right? But yet, right, yet we know the benefits and the value of taking time to unpack and to do this work. We know that equity and justice are not just going to be advanced, right, without some of this fundamental kind of root keeping. If you think about a garden, you want to make sure the soil is healthy, the right ingredients, there's enough sunlight, right, enough water. If roots are not being grown healthy, you're not going to have healthy growth. And just simply cutting branches and tending, it might not be enough. Sometimes we have to do that deeper work. But when we do, right, the promise of having that healthier garden, the nourishment that can grow forward. So again, some things for us to work through, right, and think through. And again, you'll get the slides, so feel free to kind of use them and think about them as is helpful for you and your organization. So again, last time we talked about the 5 R's of cultural humility. We also looked at the cultural humility humble model, an acronym that can be helpful in this work. And so I just placed that here as, again, a quick reminder, right? And if you weren't with us last time, feel free to go back and kind of watch the recording, or just kind of check out these models as tools for your toolbox. When it comes to ongoing reflection with cultural humility, we want to, again, start to think about the social identities and the intersections between our identities. So we start by asking critical questions about ourselves and asking critical questions to understand deeply the beautiful diversity around us. And this becomes important, right? It's interesting. I was at a public school, a public elementary school just yesterday doing some work. And they've done these series of workshops because there's a lot of issues right now going on in the community. It's very high poverty school, over 98% on free and reduced lunch, very segregated economically and racially, lots of big systemic issues. So one of their big focuses or goals is to do outreach with parents and guardians and community. And in doing so, right, they've done these workshops, very thoughtfully designed. But here's the thing. There's a large percentage of the population that does not speak English in the community with parents and guardians. And they never once thought about, with these workshops, we need to have a translator, or we need to offer workshops separately in a different language, right? With people who can speak that language, insider knowledge and lived experience. Because the dominant values were showing up, right? That this is English, that they can take home the material, they can translate it, right? And those sentiments came out. And so it's interesting, by going through the different identities, we can really start to unpack. And culture change must include a change also in behaviors, right? Behaviors individually, but also collectively. Goes back to that other model. Some other tools for you to play with. This is the LEARN acronym, and you can look at this and kind of play with it when you have time, right? Just kinds of gives us a little acronym to think through different steps. Another one that comes out of the medical field is called ASSESS. This comes out of Bosen's work. The LEARN framework comes out of Ring's work. So there's lots of different kinds of tools for us to play with, and we can adapt these tools as well, right? And if you want help or you need more resources, don't hesitate to reach out. Always happy to share. And with that, I wish we could keep going because this stuff, it fills my heart. And I'm just so thankful for those of you who are here today in this space. But I'm going to end here and just say namaste. Thank you again. And again, let's all work together to continue to push equity forward and to embrace cultural humility and practice it in our daily lives. Thank you so much. Turn it over to Chris.
Thanks, Rajni, and thank you all for being here. That obviously concludes our cultural humility session. So 3 amazing sessions with Rajni. We can't thank you enough. I also just want to say thank you for attending this California Housing Community Development workshop session offered to emergency. I said this too many times. Emergency Solutions Grant, Coronavirus Relief and Staffing Services Contract. Look out for more information on our racial equity series. There are more trainings coming. As you exit this session, there is a 3-question survey that pops up. Please fill that out. We do take that to create new sessions, to hone in existing sessions. So please go ahead and fill that out. We really appreciate it. We will see you at the next event. Until then, have a great day. Bye.